Hey everybody, good afternoon and welcome to our next installment of Field Notes by Align AI. Today we are joined by Samir and Reagan to really talk about data stewardship. And really today's topic is that data stewardship is not what you think. So in our description, you might have noticed we discussed data stewardship as really a key component of data governance. And we see a lot of organizations really struggling with it today. So to be successful, stewards in your organization need to follow a few principles. One, being a problem solver. Two, being a creator, and lastly, being a protector of data. So in this webinar, let's discuss how employees and teams tackle each of these principles. And really, we're going to share what we've seen in our work in industry and what teams are doing today as well. And just real quick, for those getting to know us, Align AI is an AI adoption platform that helps your company accelerate and scale AI capabilities. So organizational change is hard overall, and our platform reduces the friction that AI leaders experience when maturing your company's AI processes, technical capabilities, and overall expertise. We are joined today by Samir, CEO at DataZoom today. Thank you for sitting down with us. Samir, would you please take a moment to introduce yourself, DataZoom, and really having you on the webinar today is such a treat. So any other information you can share about yourself would be much appreciated.
Sure. Well, thank you, Nick. And I had to think really hard about not calling you Nicholas, but thank you, Nick. And as we discussed before, and thank you, Reagan, for both of you inviting me onto the show, and really looking forward to our conversation. So yes, as you said, Nick, I'm the CEO of DataZoom. We are a data strategy and analytics consultancy, basically working right across the data value chain, from data strategy, creating that, and then delivering that through data management, and then data science and innovation. So we work across that, as I call it, the data value chain. That's it.
Wonderful. Thanks for joining. And Reagan, would you mind introducing yourself as well?
Yeah, of course. I'm Reagan, co-founder and CEO of Align AI. I've had the pleasure of knowing and following Samir for a while now. If you don't follow Samir, I highly recommend that you do.
Well,
he's got lots of great information and incredible guests on his show as well. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. We were just chatting before this, like what inspired this topic. And, this series is called Field Notes for a reason. We've seen a lot of these particular challenges and problems that companies are facing today. Stewardship seems like a very straightforward topic, and it seems like companies might have this down, but it's still a huge challenge. And I think it's because it's so nuanced. So I'm hoping to get into that today and kind of highlight where organizations are still struggling and maybe some approaches and techniques that they can use to advance their capability in this space.
Yeah, for attendees today, I'll be monitoring the Q&A as well as the chat. So please feel free to drop a question. That's a huge perk of doing these live, is you can ask us and Samir any questions related to today's topic, data stewardship, data quality, and data governance overall. So without further ado, let's get into it. First things first, Samir, in our conversations even ahead of this, you talked about not even really liking the term steward, kind of like in a policing way. I thought you'd expand on that to start.
Well, it's really funny, Nick, because I had a conversation with somebody during the week. Her name is Karima Markov, and she was responding to one of my posts on LinkedIn. And interesting enough, she said, I was speaking to a client of mine, or somebody she works with, or an organization she was helping, and they said, it's not as if we're stewards on an airplane. So it's such a silly term, which I thought was quite apt, really, because you think of a steward, right, as, okay, you think of a steward on one side as, helping people, get into their seat, making sure that, the safety information is out there. They've done their little, gig of telling people where the exits, seats are and the exits are. And then they serve you as you're going through. Well, some airlines don't do that anymore, but back in the old days. So when I hear the term steward, I instantly think of policing. I instantly think of this person who's standing over your shoulder and saying, you keyed that in wrongly, or I'm going to enforce this policy or procedure, and if you do that again, you're out. 3 strikes and you're out, kind of thing. So when I heard the analogy of the airline steward, I just laughed, and I thought, well, here we are, with a term that doesn't really mean much to many people, but if they do hear that term, they have so many different ideas, or their imagination runs wild. So I think for me, yes, I don't really like the term, but we're stuck with it, because if you think about where it's come from, the position of, say, Dharma, the Data Management Association, who have the book, the DM book, and they have their various components in that. So that's stuck for a long time now. Data governance itself has been around for ages. It's nothing new. Most people don't want to talk about it because it's not sexy like data science or AI. It's pretty dull. Everybody's eyes gloss over. And so I think, in my view, the steward has really been relegated to a separate division, basically. Think about the top division. They're sort of like in 3 or 4 divisions down. And it's very, the focus of data governance has always been on the ownership side, which is the top policeman or woman, and the person who's running 65,000 boards, and every board has to have their claim on data, and every board has to have their say about every single decision that's made. Well, it's not working as well as people think, and I think that's why the steward actually needs to be promoted to a far more pivotal role, and has more responsibility. And I know that we'll talk about that as well, but that's what I think about the steward as the sort of the glue that sticks things together, between data teams, between business teams, and between IT teams. So they are at the center of that when it comes to quality, when it comes to real understanding of business process, and the value of the data that sits in their domain, if they're working in a domain, or and how they work with their cross-domain stewards. So these things are really interesting, and they're not really applied very well. And companies have been doing this now for years and years, and they're still, thinking, how do we incentivize? How do we start to get this, done in a better way? Do we need to do different types? So I think that's where the steward gets a bad rap, basically.
And lots to unpack there, especially the loaded terms. I think of governance as well as one of those loaded terms where people's imagination kind of goes wild when they think about governance and what's involved in that. And really speaking to the steward role specifically, I think there are certain types of people that do a really good job in the steward role. And I think getting into that as the next conversation, just related to, if we're trying to think through who to start to assign steward responsibilities to, it seems like they're usually specifically business people, and having a good aspect of being that translator too. But what are some of the attributes of individuals you see that make for good stewards in that role?
Good question. And it's interesting for me, where I see, and I think I alluded to it slightly in my sort of preamble on that first question, which is they need to be from the business. Yeah, they need to understand the processes that are working within their domain. Let's just call it a domain, whether they're in finance, whether they're in HR, whether they're in sales, marketing, whatever it might be. They've all got systems. They need to understand the system as well. And they're probably those people who do. And so they have an understanding of process, system, and data, which is pivotal, I think, for the way that person really understands, my business process now should be utilizing this data for X, and I should get Y value out of it. So I think that's a clear responsibility and a clear demarcation as to why I think they really need to be that glue, because they bring together a lot of dimensions, not only on the business processes or on the data flows, but equally across the teams. And I think that's where they have this effect, because one, they know the data. Two, they understand the policies, and policies are good. There's nothing wrong with the policy, but equally they understand the procedures, what they need to do to get over that. Don't make it too onerous. So I always believe that bottom up data governance is much better than top down. And starting from that angle, and maybe even starting in one area, is the right way to do it. Prove it, work through what you want to enable in that domain, help the business person who is going to become the steward, train them up on the principles, but also help them to understand the ecosystem that's around them. You've got the data analysts, you've got the development team, you've got the IT team who look after systems, and you've got the data scientists who are depending on the data that's coming from each of those domains to be good, credible, the quality needs to be established, and the timeliness, and the validity, and all those good metrics that come around with quality. And so the data scientist can absolutely be able to run that, or the developer who's building that end data product like a dashboard can actually develop it on good data. So it's not necessarily just they're sitting there and beating people up because they haven't done their job properly or keyed in the data. They should be pragmatic in the way that they work in that context. And I think bottom up, establishing a bottom up approach makes it a lot easier to see where the kinks are and not be driven by these horrendous boards that are whacking you on the head when you're trying to do something.
Yeah, and Reagan, would you agree? And any additional thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, I love everything that you said. The steward's job is to add context. And
yes,
the analyst or the data scientist, they may be working with a bunch of different domains and they don't understand the nuance of the data that they're looking at. And I think it's so hard because you take somebody who thinks operationally. If you're in finance, we've got to do these tasks to get our jobs done. But all those tasks produce data. And then they don't think about okay, the data's good enough to get my job done, but it might not be good enough to do something else with it. And so you're kind of teaching people who are operationally focused the details about data, the fundamentals about data, and trying to get them to say, okay, let's have some forethought about this. If we're going to create a new field in Salesforce, what's going to be useful operationally, but also how do we ensure that information we're capturing in this system can flow to the appropriate person and be used in a meaningful way. And that's a whole different mindset for that kind of person.
I absolutely agree. I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of, a data steward has the capacity to understand the business impact. And this is, I think, largely, it's underplayed with them. And I'll give you an example. I wasn't a data steward, but when I first, my second corporate job, I was leading a team of about 50 people across the world in this insight team. And my boss said to me, we've got real problems with marketing. Can you go and find out what the issues are? And essentially I went in and I looked at conversion rates. I look at, touch points. I look at, how many people are opening emails, and, how many people are actually physically buying, particular items and so on. And then I realized that the reason why the numbers are skewed is because of the quality of the data, right? And I think because I was coming at it from a very high level, here's the issue, here's the problem, this is how many, and I got my team to look at the records that were impacted. What I forgot, and by and large, actually it was the CEO who said, great work, but how much is this costing me today?
Good question. Yeah.
And I think that's something that the data steward can work with on a number of different angles with fellow data stewards, if it's a big enough company, and fellow data people in the ecosystem, and fellow business people. Yeah. And ultimately, as Reagan said, if they are going to change something, what is the impact downstream? So I think these are the kind of things that data stewards now need to think about and need to work on, because that will help them to see, what is the impact of the business? How much is it going to cost what's the cost of the business if we don't fix this? And what is the impact to the employees who are trying to get the everyday work done? And that could be in data science, that could be in finance, that could be in the development teams, that could be in a whole raft of different teams. But essentially, they see this ecosystem as an end-to-end with their other colleagues who are working towards the same aim. And that's where that's why I advocate for bottom up as an approach, because you can be more effective. It may take a little bit longer, but I think it will definitely get there. You can get the kinks out. You can really understand the processes. You can start to understand the procedures, and there's agility in the process. Yeah, it's not just about enforcement. It's about having the agility to adapt, learn, impact what's going on in the business. And I think most of it is always just centered around on data quality and data quality. So, 60,000 records are terrible. So what?
Yeah, who fixes it? Now what? What's the next step?
Yeah,
And related to that too, you speak a lot to the steward working with finance team members potentially to help quantify impact, along with the IT team and the analytics team and the data scientists in there too.
yeah.
And I think all of this we're speaking to is a lot of responsibility. It's especially when you're starting to integrate stewardship with an existing role. So I want to get into what we've seen just related to incentivization. So how do we incentivize individuals to start to take on this stewardship role?
Well, let me just back up for a minute. So one of my clients was making people redundant, and there were people in the operational teams, and they were spinning up a data governance program, but they wanted to do it domain specific. And what happened was, as they identified those operational teams, those people who were going to be made redundant and laid off, they actually thought, we can retrain these guys because we can take them from where they are. They know the business inside out. They've been with us for a long time. We should incentivize them. We can't let them go because essentially they are very, very valuable people to us. And within a year of doing this domain-specific stewardship approach, these business people were elevated to different roles within the capacity of the business because they really understood what was going on. So they need to be incentivized. Yes, they do. Again, I think it depends on the maturity angle of the organization, as we had discussed.
Yeah.
If you've got an organization with a very low data maturity, you are definitely going to need somebody in a full-time capacity. They cannot work. We have tested it. It doesn't work. With a construction company we're working with, we put them in the we put those a few data stewards specifically in the property entity, the domain of property, and then we needed 2 rather than 1 because it was quite a complex domain, and they were supposedly being half, 50% data steward, 50% their property role and responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't work. They needed to be taken out of that. They needed to be backfilled, but they were then incentivized because they knew that data was so important. So they were given a little bit more money, given a little bit more of a better title, and there it became a real, I would say, game changer for them because they felt like they were celebrated. They felt like they had there was desire in the company to do this, and it allowed them to have accountability for some of the things that they needed to get done. But if they had to do it in the capacity of half with their day job and just becoming a data steward, it tore them apart. They didn't have enough time. They didn't have the impact. They couldn't have the right conversations. They couldn't embed the right principles within the role. So I think incentivization, it does mean that you need to really clearly outline what they need to do, how they're incentivized, whether that's with, if it's a startup with stock, if it's, a bigger company, they can be given, a pay rise. They could be given more holidays if they're not, so there's different ways to incentivize it. They could be given a, I don't know, a little nice bonus at the end of the year.
Sure.
If they hit specific. So I think there's lots of ways that you can do this stuff, right? But you really need to think about the role and don't use it as a cookie cutter approach. Data steward does this and that's it, and all they're worried about. But I think it's that responsibility that they're longing for, because they can definitely do a lot more than the data owner can. Data owners, has traditionally always been up at the top. They're signing checks, hopefully, and they're approving things that are going to impact people at the operational levels. So I think, from my point of view, incentivization is good. It's just managing it in the context of that company and how they can, how they can get people to be more productive in a difficult role, which it is. It's not an easy role, right? Because there are lots of stakeholders. And I think one of the things that I feel sometimes actually is that the data stewards should have greater power than the data owner, I'm saying that now because they really do have a much bigger understanding of what's going on in their business. Not to say that the data owner doesn't, but the data owner could, it's very, very much at the high level, and they've got different viewpoints, different, abilities. So sometimes I think they should be slightly elevated into bigger roles and have more freedom.
As well as be provided the learning opportunity to be able to do that capability too. So we talk about incentivizing to create the capacity, but also putting them through learning and education to help them be enabled to be an effective data steward too. If we're expecting folks from the business to start to take on this role, it's how do I do this effectively and how do we do this consistently if we're going to start to put a steward label on roles around the organization too. So definitely education is a key aspect of it.
Yeah, and I haven't, let's bring Regan in because we have. So from your experiences, Regan, we've now come to the point where lots of organizations are thinking of going to become federated organizations within teams, and how do we start to do that? And I know you violently nodded your head when I talked about a bottom-up approach, which I think will lend itself to that. What's your experience in I'm going into interviewing mode now. Podcast interviewing mode.
Help yourself, Samir.
I can't, can I?
No, I mean, governance, we tried top-down governance. Every single company has tried top-down. It's easier because the people who are motivated to do it are the ones that want it to happen, because they're responsible for it. So top-down is natural for leaders.
Yes.
But to your point, like the bottom-up is only possible if you have your organizational structure aligned to that. Like you can't, I've seen lots of companies do this for the first time. They're like, okay, we need a data steward. Great. This person who's already maxed out on capacity, we're going to add these 6 roles and responsibilities to this person.
Yep.
And we're going to expect them to prioritize it.
And
they will not, because this is like keeping your room clean, right? Like it's not a critical function when you wake up. You're like, oh, this is exactly what I need to do, immediately. And that's the problem with the bottom-up approach, is because the organizational structure is not incentivizing individuals to prioritize it. And that's very frustrating as like someone trying to help a company, because there's only so much you can do on advising how to change people's roles and responsibilities. Like the company has to really want to do that. And you can try the part-time steward for a while. You can try to oversee that and see if, how well that's working. But to your point, like companies are now catching on that this is a full-time role. And like there's the ROI of that role is massive.
It's huge.
But they're not thinking about it that way when they're getting started, because they never had the function to begin with. So I love that. I think like what you're saying is gold. Like this is the crux. This is the issue that companies are facing. It's this alignment of priority.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to in some part the narrative that many CEOs and others in the C-suite have been talking about in such fervor around, we want to be a data-driven company. But when it comes down to the bottom line, that is not transcending down into the organization. And, we can talk a great game upstairs, but downstairs, unfortunately, they're kind of, getting on with their day jobs, and they need to, commit to their accountability and responsibilities that they've accepted. So I think there's got to be, no doubt, having a bottom-up approach will align people a little bit more, much quicker in that sense. And just seeing how you can affect data and the conversations that you have at that level between the different types of even owners at that level, the system owners and the custodians. People talk about custodian. There's another term that infuriates me, custodian. It sounds like someone's just going to have a prison sentence. And so I think that rapid movement, that iteration, that way of minimizing the amount of overheads with boards, you'll have your business users, then you'll have your data stewards, and then you'll have a mini board on top of that, and then you'll have other, boards like the what do they call it, the best one, the design board or whatever it's called, that good old thing that sits in IT and blocks everything you want to do. The design authority, the design authority, that's it.
Yeah.
And there's too much. So I think we have to be pragmatic. Organizations have to be pragmatic. To your point about the organizational structure, if we are going to be federated, we cannot have this big central organization telling us what to do. So we have to be nimble enough to have that, whether it's a hub and spoke, I don't know, have a small data governance ability central, but push down the authority, the responsibility, and the capacity and capability at the domain level. Because
I couldn't agree with you more. I like you're hitting on this point too of like, as these people are thinking about designing these programs, put the budget aside for this. Like think about, if you're just thinking about cost, think about how expensive that board is, that you're like spending a ton of time.
Oh gosh,
and how effective that board is. And could we reallocate, like let them focus on other things, reallocate that budget we would be spending if you looked at just number of hours spent trying to enforce it, and actually get the roles, boots on the ground, get people like actually contributing towards it. And there are easy ways to see how well that's going. Like if you have a catalog all in one spot, like,
exactly. Give them the tools.
Logging in. Like it's not hard to see activity.
Absolutely. I think what's happened, and you hit on such a, catalogs have become the in thing to have, right? And that's great because we can understand lineage. We can understand what's happening within the data sets. We can link that to maybe a business glossary. We can really see whether definitions are being used and people aren't skewing the data for their own purposes, right? So I think all of these things are good, and I'm going to suggest that there are most people who will start with data governance think that data governance is the data strategy, right? And this is actually the wrong way around. The data strategy drives the data governance. It drives the architecture. It drives the operating model. It drives, how people will work, how they will engage with each other, the business. So I think those types of things need to be understood by organizations, both at the top level and probably -1, because that's where those people are going to say, we need this, we need a, so I remember walking into an organization, an insurance company, and they said, right, well, the data strategy is going to give us data governance, right? Now, well, it's going to give you more than that. That's a component, right? So I think that education still needs to be done as well. But to go back to your point, it's all about value. It's all about the bottom line, right? If we can get data stewards to understand the underlying issues, that's one thing. But if we can attach it to a dollar value or a pound value or whatever it might be in whichever country, that's the main aspect, whether you do work with your finance team, because when they do put that budget aside, they know that there's going to be a certain amount for fix. There's going to be a certain amount for, maybe bringing some external help or buying an external tool. These are the things that need to be done. Cost benefit analysis needs to be done and that's why I think starting with a domain specific view of areas where, you've uncovered stuff in the data maturity assessment, this is the place which has got actually a number of things, but has got, an area where, there's a lot of wastage, i.e. money wastage, and we can probably help that very quickly, as you said, Regan. So I think that whole preamble to actually getting to implement this new structure can be done with agility. So you can test and learn, understand the cost, understand the value, start to pitch away at it, build those little tools that you might need. You don't need to invest in huge amounts of technology either, to be fair, right? If you're small enough, you can run this stuff on spreadsheets, dare I say it, but you can, okay? You
Now to
can
just
if
get
you're small
buy-in
enough.
from that domain, like
Yeah,
run this
exactly.
experiment with us.
Yeah. And once you've experimented and they see how it works, you adjust it several times, and then you say, do you know what? Now perhaps we can invest in a technology that might help us support maybe a data catalog tool, or data observability as well. So, that's what the kind of, and then they're more proactive. It's not just I'm going to get my ruler and as I always say, hit somebody on the head or take them, or the custodian's going to come in and put the handcuffs on. That's the bit which I think we need to get better at as organizations, and not have a 3 to 5 year data governance program which doesn't necessarily give the value back to the organization. So lots to talk about, but I think when it comes to a steward, they know what they should be doing, and they instinctively do, because they've seen it, they know the impact, they understand the value, and that ecosystem needs to be supportive and collaborative. If that's not there, then they can't do their job. And that's the win-win, I think, with the data ecosystem and working in a way that you can be. Well, I talk about working with agility. I don't talk about agile. I talk about agility, because you need to be nimble enough to pivot when you need to, and know what's wrong, and then get on top of things, whether it's having a dashboard, key metrics, whatever that might be. But start somewhere. You've got to start tracking.
Fantastic points, and the 30 minutes has flown by, Samir.
Has it? Oh my goodness.
Our viewers as well. Starting simple, bottom up, figuring out a way to incentivize, as well as focusing on an individual domain, and really centering efforts around the impact that it drives back for that individual domain, and really progress over perfection around starting simple. Don't do the work for the tool, let the tool work for you in that way too. So all fantastic points, Samir. Thank you for your time.
Perfect.
For folks who are interested in learning more, obviously check us out at getalignai.com. And Samir, I want to give you some time to promo anything that you have coming up as well before we go ahead and wrap up.
Sure. Well, I have an event coming up tomorrow around data science, building data science teams that will be impactful, and the trials and tribulations of embedding and embedding that into a very low maturity organization. And I do the data strategy show as well, which you can see on most podcast platforms, and you can visit the data strategy page on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn as well, or you can email me on samir@datazoom.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Samir. Reagan, again, thank you both
Pleasure.
for your time today. Appreciate it. And with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up our webinar. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day. Bye.